Hello, and welcome back everyone to yet another awesome lesson in web development. In this lesson, we are going to focus on the introduction to PHP. Given that we've covered CSS, HTML, as well as JavaScript, this is an absolutely great time to focus on PHP. Now let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. First of all, we'll kick things off by understanding server-side technology. We've covered this in previous lessons, but PHP is all about server-side technology. So we will revisit some of those concepts and principles as we progress. Next, we'll start exploring the actual PHP programming language. And then lastly, we'll actually install our server-side application, which is going to be the server that we'll be working with as we progress throughout this lesson and future lessons. Now, before we dive right into the content, there are a couple of prerequisites that one must take into account as we progress with PHP. The first being that you should have a fairly good understanding of using HTML as well as CSS. Well, CSS not so much, but definitely HTML. And then lastly, you also want to make sure that you have a fairly good understanding of JavaScript. Now, JavaScript and PHP are two entirely different languages, but when used together, they can really make your website very, very dynamic. Awesome. Now, with all of that being said, I do think it's time that we kick things off with our very first topic today, and that is server-side technologies. And here we are essentially just going to recap everything we've already learned about server-side technologies. And the reason for this is because PHP is a server-side programming language. So revisiting some of those concepts might just be helpful. Now let's take a step back and revisit one of our previous slides in one of our previous lessons. And essentially we're just going to look at things from a holistic point of view. And in this view over here, we've covered everything from graphics, the design of our website, the layout, the color. We've also covered the different programming languages, including HTML, CSS, as well as JavaScript, which is all front-end programming languages. We are now going to move into the back-end sphere of things, where we will cover things like PHP as well as SQL in our future lessons. SQL is our database language. And essentially, the blue sphere just represents everything on the front end of a website or web stack, whereas the full stack includes both the front and the back end stack. Okay, so the ideal or the way to think about this is that if you combine both, that is considered full stack web development, where we combine the front end as well as the back end technologies. Fantastic. Now, first of all, let's revisit the concept of web servers. Now, what exactly is a web server? A web server is a computer that hosts web content or files that make up the structure of websites. For the most part, we've worked with some of these resources or some of these files. And this includes your HTML files, your CSS files, your JavaScript files, and even things like your images and videos and so on. These items or all of this content, generally speaking, is hosted on a web server on the internet. Now, the idea behind a web server is that it responds to client requests by the following approaches. First, transferring files and scripts to the web client over the browser. Remember, our client is considered the browser. And then secondly, by generating a response by invoking scripts and querying a database. Keep in mind, we have several different architectures when it comes to the web server or the client server architecture. Now, previously, we also spoke about this idea of the server-side scripting. Again, we've covered front-end scripting. It's now time to actually start playing around with our server-side languages. And server-side scripting is essentially when a script is run by the server software, the backend. So not necessarily your client, okay? Everything is hosted on your web server. The server responds to the client's request, and the request is largely shaped by what the user wants to do. Okay. Server-side scripting is also ideal for databases, especially SQL databases, and we'll cover that at a later stage when we actually work with the SQL syntax. And scripting languages for back-end or server-side scripting include languages such as PHP, Node.js, and Python. Now, we are not going to cover Node.js and Python over here, but these are two very, very popular alternatives to PHP if you want that as a preferred programming language for your back-end. Now, in one of our previous lessons, we spoke about two different kinds of architectures when it comes to the web. You have a two-tier architecture, which is your very basic one, and we also have a three-tier architecture. Going forward, we are going to be focusing on a three-tier architecture, especially when we start working with databases. Now, the three-tier architecture often includes databases and related software applications that supply information to the web server. The web server can then use the output of these software applications when responding to the client's request instead of just delivering a web page, for example. Now, let's have a look at how all of this basically plays out. Essentially, the client makes a request over the internet or an HTTP request over the internet using a TCP/IP protocol. And this request either gets logged onto the server and the database, or sometimes just onto the server. And then the server would essentially respond based on what that request is. Here's a typical example. If you are visiting an e-commerce website and you filter your search by a specific category, that request is sent to the backend, and the backend sends everything based on your request. So let's say you're looking for car engines, you're looking under the car engines category. All the data that will be sent from the server back to the client will be only specific to that specific category. So car engines in this case. Excellent. Now let's move forward and let's take a moment to discuss the PHP programming language. So what exactly is PHP? Well, PHP, also known as Hypertext Preprocessor, is a server-side scripting programming language, as we mentioned before. And it is also a powerful tool for making dynamic and interactive web pages or applications by connecting with a database. PHP is basically used for developing web-based software applications. And PHP files are saved with the extension of .php, much like our JavaScript files are saved as .js. So why should we even take the time to learn PHP? Well, it's a definite must for developers or web developers. It's actually one of the most and widely adopted languages when it comes to developing web applications. Now, there are some really great alternatives out there. As we mentioned before, Node.js and Python are really great alternatives, but PHP is a great place to start when you start learning about web servers. Now, according to the PYPL index, PHP is actually ranked as the 6th most popular language worldwide at the time of recording this. Now, PHP is also one of the highest ranking languages, as we mentioned before, not just by the PYPL index, but other indexes as well. Now, there is also database integration with PHP, which is one of the reasons a lot of developers flock to using PHP as a server-side language. And then lastly, it has a large support for a number of protocols out there, such as email protocols, including POP3 as well as IMAP. Now, there are also a ton of applications behind using PHP. First of all, we can actually perform system functions using this programming language. One of the biggest reasons, again, to migrate or flock to PHP is for data management reasons, especially if you are working with a database. You can perform things such as CRUD operations, create, read, update and delete operations, just to mention a few. You can also manage user access such as authorization and logging using PHP. And then lastly, PHP offers you the opportunity to use data encryption. Wonderful. Now, with all of the housekeeping out of the way, I think we can actually start with our first demonstration or our first tutorial, and that is installing the server-side software that we are going to use going forward. Now, in order to install the server-side software that we're going to be working with, you can simply just run a Google search on XAMPP. And generally speaking, it will be the first result over here. Now, what exactly is XAMPP? XAMPP is a server-side technology that allows you to install a server on your local machine, as if you actually have a server being hosted on the internet. The most important thing to note here is that there are alternatives as well. There are solutions such as WAMP, LAMP, MAMP, but essentially they do the exact same thing. I just prefer XAMPP because it's one of my personal favorites. So after you've navigated to the website, you can simply just click on the download button over here, depending on your operating system. In my case, I'm going to go with Windows. Now, I do have the software installed already, so I can actually just cancel this. I'm going to walk you through how exactly we can install the software if you don't have it installed. Okay, so I'll just close this off over here. And then I'll simply navigate to the folder where I have it installed. And I'm just going to head over to my desktop, my sandbox environment, web dev downloads, and you'll notice I have it over here. So after I click on it, you'll be prompted. You might not be able to see this on your screen, but you'll be prompted whether or not you want to install this. I'll say yes. And I should be greeted by this bitnami. Now don't stress too much about this notification over here. You can simply just click OK. We can then click next, and then you can ensure that you have all of these ticked over here. These are the modular packages that come along with your XAMPP server software. So I'll click next, and then you also want to make sure you have it in your C drive, directly in your C drive, okay, or your D drive if you prefer that. So again, I do have this installed, so if I click next, it's actually going to tell me that this folder is not empty. In the case that you don't have this installed, everything should run just fine, and you should see some sort of progress bar. By the end of that progress bar, if you see a message asking you if you want to start the control panel, you can simply click on yes. Now, clicking on that control panel is the equivalent of starting your XAMPP server via your search bar. So you can actually just search XAMPP, and you'll see XAMPP control panel over here. Now click on this, and these are the most important things to note for this particular demonstration. You want to make sure that you can actually start your Apache server, and you want to make sure that you can start your MySQL database. We don't necessarily need the SQL database for now, but I'll just start it to make sure everything is working fine. Now, there are a couple of issues that you might run into here. First of all, if your Apache server is in orange or yellow or red, that means there is some sort of issue, okay? The same goes for your MySQL database. What you could do is you could have a look at the logs to see what exactly is going on in terms of errors and so on. And there is a ton of resources on the internet in terms of how you change your ports, okay? You need to have access to ports that are open. That's going to allow you to run your Apache server and your MySQL database. This is a common issue, but again, there are a ton of resources from the XAMPP community in terms of how to fix this issue if you do have a yellow or orange or red status. Now, the reason we want to make sure these two are active, or at least our Apache server, because that is our server going forward. So how does all of this work, and how can I test that my local host is up and running? Well, I can simply just navigate to my browser, and I want to run localhost PHP my admin. Now, the one thing you want to take note of here is if I go and type out, let me actually type this out from scratch. When you type this out and you get a result that has this orange icon here, that means you are in your local environment. If you have an icon that shows something like localhost, let's just do this again, localhost. If you have a search bar icon, that means you are running a Google search. Okay, so very, very, very important. You want to make sure that you have this icon over here. So localhost. Now, a couple of things to note. You'll see that this has a icon that shows you that this is not secure, and we are not using an HTTPS protocol, which means we are not using any sort of certificate. Why? Because this is being hosted locally. Don't stress, you are working locally, so you don't have much to worry about. Now, if you are able to access this dashboard, that means your XAMPP server is up and running and everything is working just fine. Now, we can also go ahead and validate that our database is working just fine. So I'm actually going to remove this over here, and I'm going to go PHP my admin. Okay, and again, you want to make sure that you are in your localhost environment. To ensure that that is the case, you'll notice that I have another icon over here that is not a search bar icon. So I can click on this, and there we go. My SQL database or my PHP admin is working just fine, and I've got access to my SQL database. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and in our next session, we're actually going to start writing our very first script in PHP. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.